Welcome, everyone. My name is Anna Rose. I'm the Exhibition and Programming Associate at the Wende. Thanks so much for tuning in today for our series Cold War Spaces. Our guest is Donna Stein, who will be discussing the topic Depot Space, Modern Art in Cold War Iran. Donna Stein is an art historian, curator, and critic who was educated at UCLA and the Institute of Fine Arts at NYU. She was mentored by the legendary Walter Hopps at the Pasadena Art Museum and the Conquiran Gallery of Art in Washington, D.C. After a 6-year stint at the Museum of Modern Art in New York, Stein served as an art advisor on Western modern art for the Secretariat of Her Imperial Majesty, the Shabano of Iran. Her memoir, entitled The Empress and I, How an Ancient Empire Collected, Rejected, and Rediscovered Modern Art, was just published this year. She's written extensively on her primary curatorial interests, Cubism, modern illustrated books, history of photography, and contemporary American and Iranian art. And she's organized exhibitions for cultural institutions and museums across the world, including MoMA, the National Gallery, Toledo Museum of Art, Center for Fine Arts Miami, and the Detroit Institute of Arts. Stein recently retired from museum administration after serving as deputy director of the Wende Museum of the Cold War in Los Angeles, and we're so happy to welcome her back today. The program will be about 30 minutes conversation with Segal, the Wende's chief curator and director of programming. After that, there will be about 15 minutes for Q&A, so get your questions ready to put in the Q&A box on the bottom right of your screen during that time. And as always, we appreciate everyone's questions, but please keep them short and no longer than a sentence or two. And for other comments or discussion with the other audience members, please use the chat box. And as we're getting started, you can say hi and what city you're tuning in from. We'll be posting the recording of this program on our Vimeo page and also in podcast format on our SoundCloud page. Lastly, I'd like to thank Susan Horowitz and Rick Feldman for generously supporting discussion series at the Wende and our virtual programs. And now I'll pass it off to you to get started. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Anna Rose. And Donna, welcome to Cold War Spaces, and also welcome back to the museum in a certain way even if only for the coming 45 minutes. Great to see you.
It's my honor.
Right. So I want to start with a personal question. Your book is called The Empress and I, and the Empress being Faradiba Pahlavi, the wife of the Shah of Iran. And she wanted to put together a museum of modern and contemporary art in Iran. How did you get involved in that project?
In 1972, when I was still at the Museum of Modern Art, I received a grant from the National Endowment for the Arts for museum professionals to study the art and architecture of World's Fairs and their cultural impact. And I left the museum and for 7 months traveled around the world studying World's Fairs and visiting many cities where there were no World's Fairs, but ones that I wanted to go to. And among them was Tehran. And I arrived there in the winter of '73. I had a friend from college who lived there and was married to an Iranian man. And then I had also met at the Museum of Modern Art an intern from Iran who had been sent by the Queen's office to study museums. And I was in contact with her and saw her while I was there, and continued budding friendship at the time. And came back to New York and was working at various different things. And then towards the end of '74 was invited to go for an interview in Iran for a possible position with the Queen's office.
Okay, and you accepted.
Well, eventually I accepted.
Eventually, right.
Yeah, in January of '75, I spent 2 weeks there interviewing and writing many different kinds of reports and meeting people and doing a variety of things to learn about different aspects of the art scene in Tehran. And and then when I left, I continued on my trip and spent several months in Europe, came back to New York and began working again.
Right. And can you tell us, how was it as a single American woman to live in Iran in the mid-1970s? You give us an impression.
Well, when I first started my job, I actually worked in New York for 4 months. I didn't move to Tehran until June, the end of June in 1975. And I lived there until May of 77. It was, it was an adventure for me. And as a single person, I was lucky to find, with the help of a friend, a wonderful apartment in the center of the city. And it was in a building that was relatively new and had air conditioning and heating. In the bottom of the buildings, there were 2 buildings actually around a plaza. There was like a department store. It had many different shops, including a supermarket and rug stores. And it was next door to a hospital. And it was within walking distance of my office. So it was very convenient.
Yeah,
And,
not too much of a culture shock then.
well, it was a culture shock, but especially when I got there in the summer and it was 105 to 110 degrees every day. That was a big shock.
Right, right. Okay. So in the early 1960s, that was more than a decade before you came to Iran, the Shah started his so-called White Revolution, a modernization program that included land reforms, also investment in education and health, public health. But at the same time, his regime also repressed opponents and silenced them. What was your take on Iranian politics when you lived there?
Well, I must say I went there with my eyes wide shut. I really didn't have much information about the political environment. And I was very focused on my cultural activities and interests. And, slowly I began to see what it was like. For example, when I was first there in 73, I was watching television with a friend, and there was a big parade, and all sorts of workers were marching and carrying all kinds of signs and flags. And anyway, the friend I was with said to me, well, this has all been pre-planned. Everyone had to be there. It isn't a spontaneous event. And that got me to thinking and understanding how different my experiences had been in the United States. But really, I didn't focus on that. That wasn't my particular interest.
No, but you write in your book that the Iranian Secret Service was omnipresent in society. And did you see how it impacted people? And let me also ask you, did it impact you? Did you encounter any forms of censorship or other?
Well, it did impact me. I was even threatened slightly at one point. When I was interviewing during those 2 weeks at the end of 74, my friend sat me down one evening and we talked about the Savak, actually. And she said that which people she thought might be associated in the Queen's office. And among them was the man who was human resources. And at one point he said to me, if you don't sign your second contract, you'll never work here again, threatening me that I couldn't come back to Iran. Right. And later on in my second contract, I was supposed to finish in February of 77. And I wasn't able to receive the tax papers and exit papers that I needed for another 3 months because they weren't in a hurry to get rid of me, and they weren't going to, you know, they weren't going to actually release me in February.
Right.
I had to stay there until they were ready.
I
So
see, yeah.
that was, you know, kind of an odd experience.
Right, yeah, I
say the
can
least.
imagine, yeah, yeah. So Donna, when you came to Iran, what kind of art worlds did you encounter? Was modern art in the Western tradition readily accepted? Was it maybe combined with more local Persian traditions? How did the art world look like?
Well, there was an active art scene,
Yeah.
and there were people, a lot of collectors. During the time I was there were several new galleries that opened, and some of those imported European and Western American artists' work. Most of the galleries were specialized in Iranian artists, contemporary Iranian artists, many of whom were very well informed about what was going on and even had international representation. In 1974, when I was there, they had the first international art fair, and it was more or less organized by Amy Mag from the Mag Gallery and Foundation, and it was a way of broadening out people who would come to Iran for art, and also informing those in Iran who were interested in art about what was going on elsewhere.
Right, and would you say that Western art was conceived, or yeah, Western modern art was conceived as something from the West, from a capitalist society, or was it conceived more as a universal visual language that could be taken up and used?
Well, I think that there were a lot of artists beginning maybe in the late 40s and 50s who traveled to the West, studied in the West, and were already beginning to incorporate ideas from the West. Ziapour, for example, was one of the earliest to try and incorporate the ideas of Cubism. And there were many artists who were already combining their knowledge of the Western idioms and using their historical background as a source for modern art.
Right, right. So the Empress was very active, speaking overall in all kinds of cultural activities, which she supported. And of course, what became the Tehran Museum of Contemporary Art was one of her projects. Why did she think it was important at that point to have a museum of modern and contemporary Western art in Tehran?
Well, she believed in cultural transformation, and it was part, you know, her focus in relation to the visionary plan that the Shah had established in 1963 was to focus on culture, social welfare, and education as a kind of secondary branch of this plan. And so, you know, she was very active, not just in modern art, but in bringing back the patrimony of her country and developing a museum for Luristan bronzes and miniatures and Qajar art, which is the 18th and 19th century period, and various other museums. She started a carpet museum as well. So she felt that by making this available to her populace that in Iran, that she was helping to educate them both about her, you know, their history, as well as what was going on around them. Right. She said to me that, you know, at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, they show the Near Eastern art. Why shouldn't we show the Western art? And indeed, you know, the artists, a lot of them who went abroad, were interested in showing and seeing what was going on elsewhere.
Right. So what was your personal relation to the Empress?
Well, you know, at the time I was there, I really didn't have a personal relationship. You know, you can't go up and talk to royalty unless you are officially introduced. And she was ever present in my life. There were pictures of her everywhere. She was on, you know, I would read about her every day in the newspaper. So, you know, she was an important force in my life. However, I didn't have many opportunities to engage with her personally. The only time that and the first time that I met her was, not the only time I met her, but the first time I met her was in August of '76, which was a year and a half after I had moved to Iran. And you know, I was invited to join her with about 10 other people and go to the Shiraz Arts Festival, which we spent 3 days seeing traditional and avant-garde art forms. And she said to me at that time that she thought of me, from what she had been told, that I was an older woman with glasses, which I've become. But at the time I was young and sophisticated.
Right. Yes.
Quite different. Anyway, it was only after I think I left Iran that I began to have some contact with her, you know, at a distance. That was because in 1990, through an Iranian friend of mine, I had requested an interview with her because I wanted to write about her art programs. I thought they were far-reaching. They were the first to really think about art in a global context, and the effort she had made to engage in the East and the West, I thought were very important. And so she, at the time, gave me a 2.5-hour on-the-record interview. But I wasn't able to actually publish anything of it until 2013. And then I just published a small portion of it, which was specifically about the arts. For my book, I have now published the extended interview, which includes her interests in education and social welfare and medicine and all sorts of other subjects.
Right. Thank you. So the collection of the Tehran Museum of Contemporary Art is quite stunning. Actually, it's a beautiful collection, and you were instrumental in getting that collection together. Can you tell us a little bit how that worked, and also maybe you can focus on one example, Jackson Pollock's mural on Indian red ground from 1950, which is such an important work in his oeuvre. How did you get hold of that?
So when I went to interview, I wrote many reports, and among them was an acquisitions policy, which they did not have until that time. And I was told when I was interviewing that the Queen had requested that the museum start with Impressionism. So I developed an approach which was kind of hieroglyphics. It was a list of 3 different lists of artists, beginning with Impressionism to the present time. And the first group were artists that I felt were essential and had to be shown in many media. And then the second group were artists that I felt were appropriate and could be shown in one example, major example, a painting or a sculpture. And then the third was other works that filled in the context and the history, but were not essential in terms of important media like painting and sculpture, but could be acquired in works on paper.
Mhm.
And I had been actually hired initially just to do the works on paper collection, which would include prints and drawings and photographs and illustrated books and posters.
Right.
And I had, but from the beginning, when I was there, I was already helping to select paintings and sculptures in 1974 from the International Art Fair.
Mhm.
And we bought several important things by Giacometti. There were 2 sculptures and a painting of Yanahara, all from around 1960. And then there was a sculpture by Braque and a painting from the mid-30s by Kandinsky. So there were some serious and wonderful works at that time acquired. And then when I went to New York and worked for 4 months, I spent my time going around to galleries, to private dealers, to graphic workshops, to private collections and artist studios. And I set aside works, and at the end of May in 75, 3 Iranians, my boss, who was the chief of the Queen's Secretariat, the former UN ambassador, who was an art collector, and also a colleague from the Queen's office who was my friend.
Mhm.
And I took them around to all the places where I had set aside work. And in 10 days, we bought 125 works, which included a major painting by Tehran called The Golden Age, which was in the Fauve exhibition that MoMA did. It was actually the first work to be lent from the National Collection of Iran. We bought also a major synthetic cubist painting that had formerly been in the Norton Simon collection in California. And that was view through the window on the Rue de Ponthièvre in Paris. We also bought a major sculpture called The Bamboon and Young by Picasso,
Mhm.
and a tapestry called Secrets from the 30s by Picasso. And, you know, hundreds of, I mean, many works on paper, drawings, prints, books, photographs, as
Yeah.
well as other paintings and sculptures.
Yeah, it must have been so exciting to be able to collect these works
Yeah.
at the time.
And
Yeah.
when we were in New York, we went to see in the private collection of William Rubin, the Pollock painting,
Yeah.
mural on red ground from 1950. And it was one of 55 paintings that were done in the year 1950, and about 15 drawings from that period as well. It was really an important work, and I had not found it, but I was very much in favor of its acquisition.
Right.
And it has become, I think, one of the prized paintings of the collection because of its importance as an example of abstract expressionist work, and also because it's been often shown in Iran as an example of work that they own from the Western collection. Not everything from the Western collection is shown in the museum. It has been large selections of it have been shown at different times. And the first might have been, I think, in 1999. There was a
Yeah, Donna, let's talk a little bit about that, because this program is called Depot Space.
right.
And of course, the museum opened in October 1977, but only 15 months later, there was the Islamic Revolution of 1979, and then the museum closed. And when it reopened later that year, it had a completely different art display. So most of these Western works were just condemned and led their life in the basement of the museum.
That's right.
Yeah. So that's the background of what you were going to do to speak about. So yeah, then my question would be, how did they resurface, and are they visible now?
There was a change in the presidency in 97. Khatami became the president, and he was of a more liberal nature. He had been the Minister of Culture previously, and at the museum, there was a very progressive director by the name of Dr. Sami Azar. And so in 1999, Sami Azar put on an exhibition from the Western collections, which was the first time since the death of Khomeini about 10 years earlier, who was against West toxification, that the Western collections came out, and it was extremely popular. And then again in 2005, Sami Azar did a large catalog from the collection with, I would say, a couple of hundred works, the major works in all media. And that exhibition also received a lot of attention. After 2005, there was again a change, both in terms of the directorship and the presidency, and it became more conservative. So for more than 40 years, a lot of the collection has remained in storage and very much protected. But in the last 10 years or so, many works have gone on exhibit in the museum and have been lent elsewhere. For example, the Pollock was lent to Japan and was shown in Tokyo and also in Nagoya. And at the time, they valued the painting in 2012. They didn't, Christie's did, for $250 million. So they know very well that their collection is valuable, and that's why they, for one reason, that they keep it and they take care of it.
Right. Right, thank you. So we are about to move to the Q&A, and please put your questions under the Q&A box where I will find them and read them. But in expectance of our first question, let me ask you one other thing. Donna, you're still following contemporary Iranian art. How would you say is the situation of art and artists currently in Iran, and what is their role in society, or how do they conceive their role in society?
I think it's an even more active art scene than during the 70s. There's a lot of galleries, a lot of publications. Many of them have, many artists have been educated abroad, have stayed abroad, go back and forth. So they're very informed. Beginning in the 80s, there was a lot of attention placed in photography. And in a recent exhibition, for instance, in Los Angeles, I noticed that much of the work that was shown was based on some use of the photographic techniques. So I thought that was extremely interesting.
Right, right. Thank you. We have our first question from Alicia Ait. She asks, how has your book been received in Iran?
You know, I'm not exactly sure because I don't know that they have copies of my book. I have an active Instagram account on which many Iranians participate, and I get messages, and they seem very excited and interested. I've heard from several Iranians in the States who have read the book and are thrilled to know about it. And And there's also a little bit of controversy about my book. So it's received a lot of attention though.
Yeah, can you say something about that? What kind of controversy?
Well, I would say that for a long time, people have been unwilling to acknowledge the fact that a non-Iranian person had an active role in creating the collection. And maybe it had something to do with my being a woman. I have no idea about that, but so there's a continuation of that lack of attention or lack of truth about what I did and how I did it. And also, I think that because I worked in secrecy and with discretion, which was required by the Queen's office, people didn't really know what I was doing.
Right. Why were you required to work in secrecy? Why was that?
Well, I think, at the time when this museum was being formulated, it was a depression in the world, and art was, easy to buy at relatively reasonable prices. And the Iranians from about 1972, when they only had about, the oil policies changed around 1972 through OPEC, and they had been using about $200 million or bringing in $200 million through their oil at that time. And then it transformed itself, and they were suddenly getting $20 billion from their oil industry, and by 75. And so they had a lot of money to spend. And part of it was
is that also how it was possible to put together this amazing collection? Because there was so much money, so much oil money.
Of course, right. Because the money came from the NIOC, which was their national oil conglomerate. So, yes.
Okay, thank you. We have another question. I think it's an incomplete question, but I think if I understand it correctly, she says, is there a person or a committee safeguarding the pieces from damage? So now it's complete. Is there a person or a committee?
Yeah, I think that the museum now has a very good staff who are, very active. And the museum has recently reopened after 30 months of being renovated and restored. And during that time, they cataloged the collection, and they're producing a 6-volume corpus about the artworks in the collection. And so I think that they, are serious about what they're doing. I've been in touch with the archivist there, and I learned recently that actually all my files are in their archive. So I was very glad to know that, because I had diligently put all the information about every artwork that was purchased, both in the Western collections and the contemporary Iranian collections together. And so that's accessible as well.
That's great, yeah. So you mentioned that it was not so easy to leave the country when you wanted to leave. Can you tell us the story? Why did you want to leave, or did you have to leave? What happened?
Well, I didn't have to leave. I chose to leave. After I signed my second contract, I had a trip home for the first time to New York and Los Angeles. And at that time, I realized that I really didn't want to extend my second contract beyond that year, and that I preferred to work out of my New York situation. And anyway, I told them that I wasn't going to continue, but they weren't so willing to let me go. And that was part of the problem. I was very happy that the new director of the Tehran Museum asked me to do 2 of the opening exhibitions from the collections that I helped to put together, one on photography and one on other works on paper. And so that brought me back to Tehran in October of '77 when the museum opened.
Right.
And I was very grateful for that.
Yeah, I can imagine. Yeah. Next question, someone asks, where can one get a copy of your book? It's not available on Amazon yet.
There's been a distribution problem, but if you try Artworks DAP, that's one way, or through Skira.net, that's another way. But it should be available through Amazon shortly.
Right, okay, yeah. Is there at the moment no other questions, Donna? I would like to ask you about some other work you did on contemporary Iranian artists. Can you tell us, or can you give us some example of Iranian artists you are specifically interested in? And
you know, I've actually written a lot about Monir Shahrudi Farmanfarmayan, who passed away in 2019. Right. I met her in 1975 when she had an exhibition in New York, and then she became a very good friend of mine in the years that I lived in Iran. And she had an exhibition in Paris in 1977, and I started writing about her at that time. And I've written many things on her through the years that have been published. Another artist that I knew quite well was Marco Gregorian, and he was, both of those artists were educated in America and in Europe, and also had a great interest and fondness of the arts of Iran historically, and use that in a wonderful way of showing modernist ideas from the Western point of view, as well as from the Iranian point of view. And Monir used painting behind the glass and mosaic mirroring as her art form. And one of the things that Marco was known for was his dried earth paintings, and they were earthworks that he did that were actually wall works primarily. So anyway, those are 2 of the artists that I've done a lot of work on.
Right, thank you. We have a question from Scott Schaefer, who asks, who made the decision to sell works from the collection? And maybe there's such an interesting story about Willem de Kooning from the collection. Maybe you can share that.
So as far as I know, the only work that was actually exchanged from the collection was the de Kooning Woman #3. And it was, I don't know who made that decision formally, but it would never be shown because of the Islamic attitudes towards nudity. And it took a vote of parliament to allow it to be finally exchanged. And it was exchanged for what remained of the Hotan Shahnameh from the 17th century. And that had been, had originally some 258, I think, paintings, miniature paintings. And by the time it went to Iran, it had 125. but it was still an extraordinary example of Iranian patrimony and very important for the country to have that.
Thank you. Right. Next question is, what happened to Shabano's portrait that was damaged by the mobs after the revolution? The portrait by Andy Warhol, that is.
Well, I'm not exactly sure what happened to it. It was sliced up, but whether it's still in the storeroom or whether it was, thrown out, I have no idea. But Andy had a way of working where he often made multiples of a work, and it did the painting of the Shabano and also of the Shah was shown at the Whitney retrospective of Andy Warhol in 2018. So there's at least one copy that I know still exists.
Oh, that's great.
In a private collection.
Right, yeah. So Donna, I see here a lot of very enthusiastic remarks in the chat, but no further questions. So I want to thank you very, very much for this very lively and interesting presentation. It was a delight to have you.
Thank you so much. It was really my honor.
Great. So next week we have an Art Past Present interview with Vladislav Shapovalov. And that's the 10th and actually the last Art Past Present in the series. Shapovalov did artistic research into soft power and Cold War cultural diplomacy. And from then on, we will have bi-weekly Cold War Spaces interviews. The next one being on June 30th with Karen Bijsterveld, who is a professor of science, technology, and culture at Maastricht University. And I will speak with her about voice identification and the Stasi. She's an acoustics specialist. So I hope to see you next week and then again the 30th. And thank you very much for viewing.